Lieutenant Commander David Lewis was 22 minutes from United States ship Liberty when the order came through his headset to turn back. He did not understand. His F-4 Phantom was launched from Carrier Saratoga at maximum alert. Flash priority distress call. American vessel under attack. Unidentified aircraft. Heavy casualties. The brief was clear. Get there, stop the attack. Extract wounded if the ship was sinking. Standard rescue protocol. His wingman was 300 yards off his port side. 10 more Phantoms from America were inbound from the south. Liberty would have air cover in minutes. Then the radio crackled. 6th Fleet Command. Recall all aircraft. Return to carrier immediately. Lewis keyed his microphone. Say again, I did not copy. Recall. Return to base. Direct order. He checked his fuel. Plenty of range. He checked his radar. No hostile contacts. He checked his mission clock. 18 minutes to target. He asked the only question that made sense. Is Liberty secure? Negative. Recall stands. Orders from Washington. Lewis had flown combat missions over Vietnam. He had launched from carriers under fire. He had been shot at by surface-to-air missiles and lived. He understood orders. He also understood that somewhere ahead of him, Americans were dying and calling for help, and he was being told to abandon them. He asked for confirmation. The response was immediate and final. Presidential order. Do not proceed to Liberty. Return to carrier. Acknowledge, Lewis acknowledged. He banked his aircraft east and watched his mission clock count down the minutes Liberty did not have. That was June 8th, 1967. 14:26 hours. Mediterranean Sea. What Lewis did not know yet was why the order existed. What he would learn later was that President Lyndon Johnson had personally intervened. The president was on a telephone call with Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. The carrier group was preparing to launch a second wave of fighters. Johnson asked who was attacking the ship. McNamara said preliminary reports indicated Israeli aircraft. Johnson said recall the planes. McNamara confirmed the order. Johnson clarified he would not embarrass an ally. The fighters turned back. Lewis found this out 6 months later when he was transferred stateside and debriefed by naval intelligence officers who wanted to know what he saw and heard. He told them. They told him he was mistaken. They told him the incident was a tragic case of mistaken identity. They told him operational security required his silence. They told him discussing the incident with anyone including family would result in court-martial. Lewis said nothing for 30 years, but on June 8th at 14:26 hours, Lewis only knew he was ordered away from a ship that needed him. He flew back to Saratoga and landed. He climbed out of his cockpit and stood on the deck and looked west toward where Liberty was still burning. On Liberty, the attack had started 28 minutes earlier. The crew saw Israeli jets approach at 13:55 hours. Mirage fighters, high speed, no warning. The first cannon rounds hit the bridge and killed the helmsman instantly. 30mm shells ripped through the communication spaces and destroyed the radio equipment. Napalm canisters exploded across the deck. Men burned. Others drowned when torpedo boats arrived and blew a 40-foot hole in the hull below the waterline. The radio men fought to repair one transmitter while the ship was breaking apart around them. They got it working at 14:20 hours and sent the second distress call. They heard 6th Fleet acknowledge. They heard the fighters were coming. Then they heard nothing. What they did not hear was the order to recall. What they did not know was that help had been 18 minutes away and was sent back. They knew only that the attack continued. The torpedo boats circled and fired into the hull. They shot at the lifeboats. They machine-gunned sailors in the water. Petty Officer Philip Turney was on deck when the torpedo hit. The blast threw him into a bulkhead and broke his arm. He crawled through flooding compartments, dragging wounded men toward hatches that were not yet sealed. He heard the loudspeaker system announce that fighters were inbound. He repeated this to the men around him. "Help is coming. Hold on. Help is coming." The fighters never arrived. Turney learned why 6 days later when Liberty reached Malta and the crew was sequestered. An officer told them the attack was a mistake. Turney said he watched torpedo boats shoot at lifeboats for 45 minutes. The officer said operational security required silence. Turney asked when they could write letters home. The officer said all communication was suspended pending investigation. Turney asked how long. The officer said indefinitely. Turney said nothing for 28 years. The Navy convened a court of inquiry on June 10th. Admiral Isaac Kidd presided. The court had 1 week to investigate. Kidd interviewed the senior surviving officers. He did not interview the enlisted men who saw the lifeboats destroyed. He did not interview the radio men who heard the recall order acknowledged. He did not request testimony from the pilots who were turned back. The court concluded the attack was a case of mistaken identity. Israel apologized. The matter was closed. The crew knew the conclusion was false. They had seen Israeli reconnaissance aircraft circle the ship 8 times before the attack. They had seen the aircraft fly low enough to read hull numbers. They had seen the American flag, 5 feet by 8 feet, in calm wind. They had counted the minutes between reconnaissance and attack. 2 hours. Plenty of time to confirm identity. But they had been ordered to remain silent, and most of them obeyed. James Ennis obeyed. He was 21 years old and below decks when the attack started. He survived by sealing himself in a compartment while napalm burned overhead. He helped carry body bags to the forward hold. He watched officers confiscate cameras and film. He received the order not to speak. He went home to Philadelphia 3 months later and told his family he had an unremarkable deployment. He did not mention Liberty for 40 years. Lloyd Painter obeyed. He was a damage control specialist who fought fires while the ship was under torpedo attack. He pulled 7 wounded men from flooded spaces. He was recommended for commendation. The recommendation was classified and never processed. He was told not to discuss his injuries. He told no one for 35 years, but some men did not obey. Commander William McGonigal refused. He was the commanding officer. He remained on the bridge despite shrapnel wounds that severed tendons in both legs. He kept Liberty operational and prevented her from sinking. The Navy awarded him the Medal of Honor. The ceremony was held at the Washington Navy Yard, not the White House, which was unprecedented. President Johnson did not attend. No press was permitted. McGonigal received the nation's highest military honor in a closed room with no cameras and no public record. He was told not to discuss the circumstances. He refused. He spoke about Liberty until he died in 1999. The truth came slowly. National Security Agency documents were declassified in 2003. The transcripts showed Israeli pilots reporting to their command that they could see the American flag. They asked for confirmation to continue the attack. They received confirmation. They continued. The transcripts showed Israeli Naval Command ordering the torpedo boats to leave no survivors. Direct quote, "No survivors." The transcripts showed United States 6th Fleet received the distress calls in real time. They showed fighters launched. They showed the presidential order to recall. They showed Admiral Geiss protesting the order. They showed McNamara overruling the protest. The survivors read these documents 36 years after the attack. They learned that their own government knew they were being killed and chose not to intervene. They learned that the rescue fighters were 18 minutes away. They learned that President Johnson personally ordered the abandonment to preserve diplomatic relations with Israel. Lewis read the documents in 2003. He was 64 years old and retired. He had flown 130 combat missions in Vietnam after Liberty. He had trained generations of naval aviators. He had never discussed June 8, 1967. When the documents were declassified, reporters called him. He agreed to speak. He described the recall order. He described flying away from a ship that needed him. He described landing on Saratoga and learning later that 34 Americans died while he was ordered not to help them. He was asked if he thought the order was justified. He said no. He was asked if he understood why it was given. He said yes. He was asked if he could forgive the decision. He said no. Torney spoke in 2003. He described the torpedo boats shooting at lifeboats. He described being told the attack was a mistake. He described staying silent for decades because he believed his government would eventually acknowledge the truth. He was asked why he stayed silent so long. He said he was a sailor and he followed orders. He was asked if he regretted that choice. He said every day. NS spoke in 2005. He described the napalm and the body bags and the confiscated cameras. He described being 21 years old and trusting that silence served a purpose. He was asked what purpose. He said none. He was asked what he wanted now. He said recognition, not for himself, for the men who died believing help was coming. Help was coming. It was 18 minutes away. It was recalled. That is what happened on June 8, 1967. An American ship was attacked in international waters for 75 minutes. 321 men were aboard. 34 died. 171 were wounded. Their own fighters were launched and recalled. Their own government ordered them abandoned. Their own navy told them it was a mistake and ordered them silent. Most obeyed. Some did not. The attack happened 60 years ago. The last survivors are dying. No American official has ever been held accountable for the recall order. No investigation has ever examined why the president chose to abandon the crew. The official position remains that the attack was a tragic accident and the recall was a prudent decision. Lewis died in 2010. Turney died in 2018. Ines died in 2022. They spent decades trying to force their government to acknowledge what happened. They testified before Congress. They spoke to reporters. They wrote letters. Nothing changed. The ship still exists. Liberty was repaired and returned to service under a different name. She was finally scrapped in 1994. Parts of her hull were saved. A memorial was built in Florida. The survivors gather there each year, fewer each time. On June 8, 1967, President Johnson made a choice: preserve relations with an ally or protect American sailors. He chose the ally. The sailors died or survived and were told not to speak. Most obeyed. That is the first 75 minutes of what happened to Liberty. What happened after took 50 years and is not finished. Admiral Isaac Kidd arrived in Malta on June 10, 1967. He was 62 years old, decorated, respected, 2 years from retirement. His father had died at Pearl Harbor in 1941, killed on the bridge of battleship Arizona. Kidd understood what it meant when sailors died and the nation needed answers. He was assigned to conduct the formal inquiry into the Liberty incident. He had 1 week. The assignment came directly from Admiral John McCain, Commander-in-Chief of United States Naval Forces Europe. The written order was clear: determine the facts of the attack, assess culpability, recommend action, complete investigation in 7 days. Standard protocol required weeks or months for an incident of this magnitude. 34 dead, 171 wounded, 75 minutes of sustained attack, over 300 potential witnesses. Kidd understood that 7 days was not adequate. He also understood it was not negotiable. He began interviews on June 11th. Commander McGonigal sat in a borrowed office with his legs bandaged and elevated. Shrapnel wounds required surgery, but he refused hospitalization. Kidd asked him to describe the attack. McGonigal spoke for 90 minutes. He described 8 reconnaissance flights before the attack. Israeli aircraft circling low enough to read hull markings, close enough to see the American flag clearly. 2 hours between final reconnaissance and first attack. Plenty of time to confirm identity. Kidd asked if McGonigal believed the Israelis knew they were attacking an American ship. McGonigal said yes. Kidd asked for direct evidence. McGonigal said he had observations, timeline, physical damage patterns. He did not have intercepted Israeli communications. He had what he saw. Kidd interviewed the executive officer, the navigator, the communications officer. Their accounts corroborated McGonigal. All described the reconnaissance flights. All described the flag. All described systematic destruction of communications equipment, followed by attempts to sink the ship. None had direct evidence of Israeli intent, only observations and conclusions. On June 13th, Kidd interviewed enlisted crew. Petty Officer Turney described watching torpedo boats shoot at lifeboats for 45 minutes, machine gunning the rafts while sailors tried to launch them, firing on men in the water. Kidd asked if anyone photographed this. Turney said yes. Several men had cameras. Kidd asked where the photographs were. Turney said officers confiscated all cameras immediately after the attack. Operational security. Kidd requested the confiscated film. He was told it had been classified and sent to Washington for analysis. He asked when it would be available. He was told not within his timeline. He asked if he could extend the timeline. He was told no. On June 14th, Kidd examined Liberty in dry dock. The torpedo hole was 40 feet wide. 3 compartments collapsed. The bridge was shredded with hundreds of bullet holes. Napalm had burned through deck plating. Multiple lifeboats showed bullet damage. 1 boat was destroyed completely. Kidd documented everything. He had clear evidence of what happened. He did not have evidence of why. On June 15th, Israeli officials submitted their explanation. Mistaken identity. Liberty confused with Egyptian vessel El Qusair during active combat operations. Tragic error. Deep regret. Offer of compensation. On June 16th, Kidd compiled his findings. He wrote that the attack was not justified. The reconnaissance flights should have provided identification. The duration and intensity were inconsistent with mistaken identity procedures. But without direct evidence of Israeli command communications, he could not conclusively prove the attack was deliberate. He recommended further investigation with full access to Israeli military records. He submitted the report on June 17th, 1 week as ordered. The report went to Admiral McCain, who forwarded it to Chief of Naval Operations in Washington. The chief read it and noted the ambiguity. The report said the attack was not justified, but could not prove it was deliberate. The White House wanted closure. Israel wanted exoneration. The report provided neither. On June 18th, new instructions arrived. Revise conclusions to remove ambiguity. State clearly whether the attack was deliberate or accidental. Provide definitive findings. Kidd read the instructions in his quarters that night. He understood what was being requested. Reach a definitive conclusion based on incomplete evidence. He could declare the attack deliberate without proof. He could declare it accidental despite contradicting evidence. Either conclusion would resolve the ambiguity. Either conclusion would be false. He sat at the small desk with his original report and the statements from the crew. McGonigal describing the reconnaissance flights. Torney describing the lifeboats being shot. The radio men describing the destroyed communications equipment. The photographs that existed but were classified. The timeline that showed 2 hours between identification and attack. He read through the Israeli explanation again. Mistaken identity, combat conditions, tragic error. He had spent 30 years in the Navy. He had investigated accidents before. He knew what mistakes looked like. This did not look like a mistake, but he also knew what orders looked like, and he had clear orders to provide a definitive conclusion. He thought about his father dying at Pearl Harbor. He thought about the 34 men who died on Liberty. He thought about the difference between what happened and what he was being asked to write. At 0200 hours, he began revising the report. On June 19th, Admiral McCain summoned Kidd to his office. McCain was direct. The revised report was acceptable, but questions remained about crew discretion. The incident was diplomatically sensitive. Israel was a critical ally. The Soviet Union was actively destabilizing the region. American interests required careful management of the situation. Kidd said he understood the diplomatic considerations. He asked what would happen to his original findings. McCain said they would remain classified. Kidd asked for how long. McCain said indefinitely. McCain told Kidd that his service was valued and his career prospects remained strong. He told him that cooperation in sensitive matters was noted and rewarded. He told him that unnecessary complications could affect those prospects. He did not need to be more explicit. Kidd signed the revised report. The conclusion stated that the attack appeared to be a case of mistaken identity, committed under the stress of combat operations during an active war. Israel had apologized. The matter was resolved. Before Kidd left Malta, a young sailor approached him near the dock. Petty Officer James Ennis, 21 years old. He had been below decks during the attack. He had helped carry body bags afterward. He asked Kidd if the investigation would say what really happened. He said the crew wanted the truth to be official. Kidd looked at him and wanted to say that the truth was in the original report, the one being classified. He wanted to say that sometimes the truth was not convenient for people who made decisions in Washington. He wanted to say that he was sorry. Instead, he told Ennis that the investigation was complete and the findings would be released soon. He told him operational security prevented detailed discussion. He told him to trust that the Navy took care of its people. Ennis thanked him and walked away. Kidd watched him go and felt something he had not felt in 30 years of service. He felt ashamed. The crew was briefed on June 22nd. Officers assembled them in groups and read from prepared statements. The investigation had concluded the attack was a tragic case of mistaken identity. Israel had apologized and offered compensation. The matter was closed. The crew was also given orders. Do not discuss the incident with anyone outside the Navy. Do not speak to press. Do not write detailed letters home. Violation of these orders would result in court-martial. The orders were effective immediately and indefinite. Commander McGonigal listened to these orders and refused. He told the briefing officer he would not remain silent about an attack that killed 34 of his men. The officer reported this to McCain. McCain met with McGonigal privately and told him the Medal of Honor was being prepared. He told him that accepting the medal required discretion about circumstances. He told him that public contradiction of official findings would result in the medal being withdrawn and potential charges of insubordination. McGonigal accepted the Medal of Honor. The ceremony was held at Washington Navy Yard, not the White House, which was unprecedented for the nation's highest military decoration. President Johnson did not attend. No press was permitted. McGonigal received the medal in a closed room with no cameras and no public record. He also ignored the order to remain silent. He spoke about liberty whenever asked for the next 32 years until he died in 1999. But most of the crew obeyed. Petty Officer Ines returned home and told his family he had an unremarkable deployment. Lieutenant Painter was recommended for commendation, but the paperwork was classified. Petty Officer Tournay wrote no letters about what he saw. They stayed silent because they were ordered to and because speaking meant court-martial. The photographs remained classified. The original report remained classified. The recall order remained unacknowledged. The survivors remained silent. Admiral Kidd returned to the United States and continued his career. He never spoke publicly about liberty. He retired 2 years later with full honors. He died in 1999, the same year as McGonigal. His papers included a copy of his original report with handwritten notes in the margins. The notes said the attack was not consistent with mistaken identity. The notes said further investigation was warranted. The notes were never made public. The investigation was complete. The findings were official. Orders were issued. Everyone followed procedure. The result was that truth became classified, and the men who witnessed it became accomplices to its burial. This was June 1967. The matter was officially closed. What happened next took 50 years. Petty Officer James Enos returned to Philadelphia in September 1967. He was 21 years old. His family met him at the airport. They asked about his deployment. He said it was routine. They asked if he saw anything interesting. He said no. They asked if he was glad to be home. He said yes. He did not mention liberty for 40 years. He went to college on the GI Bill. He studied engineering. He married in 1971. He had 2 children. He worked for an electronics company in suburban Philadelphia. He attended family gatherings and neighborhood barbecues. He watched the news. He saw reports about the Middle East and American relations with Israel. He said nothing. In 1973, a reporter contacted several Liberty survivors. The reporter had obtained partial documents through Freedom of Information Act requests. The documents showed discrepancies between the official investigation and witness statements. The reporter asked Ines for an interview. Ines declined. He had orders. The orders were indefinite. In 1984, a book was published about the Liberty incident. The author interviewed some survivors who were willing to speak. Ines was not among them. His wife asked him once if he wanted to read the book. He said no. In 1991, his son asked him about his Navy service for a school project. Ines described basic training and technical school. He did not mention liberty. His son asked if he ever saw combat. Ines said no. Lieutenant Commander David Lewis remained in the Navy after Liberty. He flew combat missions over Vietnam, 130 missions between 1968 and 1971. He was promoted to commander in 1974. He trained naval aviators at Pensacola. He retired in 1986 with 24 years of service. He never spoke about the recall order, not to fellow pilots, not to students, not to his wife. The order had come from the president. He had acknowledged and obeyed. That was the end of the matter. In 1996, a congressional subcommittee held brief hearings on the Liberty incident. Several survivors testified. Lewis was invited to testify. He declined. He was asked why. He said he had nothing to add to the official record. He was asked if the official record was accurate. He said he was not qualified to judge. Petty Officer Philip Turney left the Navy in 1969. He returned to California. He worked in construction. He married and divorced twice. He had nightmares about the torpedo boats. He saw the lifeboats being destroyed. He heard the machine gun fire. He woke up thinking he was still in the water. He told no one. The orders were clear. Court-martial for discussing the incident. He had a family to support. He stayed silent. In 1987, he was contacted by a Liberty Survivors organization. A small group of crew members had begun meeting annually. They did not speak publicly, but they spoke to each other. Turney attended one meeting. He listened to other men describe what they saw. Lifeboats shot. Men in the water fired upon. The recall order acknowledged, but never explained. Turney realized he was not alone in what he remembered. He also realized nothing had changed. The official position remained mistaken identity. The photographs remained classified. The recall order remained unacknowledged. He continued attending the annual meetings. He did not speak publicly. Commander William McGonigal received the Medal of Honor in June 1968. The ceremony was at Washington Navy Yard. President Johnson did not attend. Secretary of the Navy, Paul Ignatius, presented the medal. No press was permitted. The citation described extraordinary heroism during an attack by unidentified forces. It did not mention Israel. McGonigal remained in the Navy until 1974. He never received another promotion. He retired as a commander. Officers who received the Medal of Honor typically advanced to admiral rank if they remained in service. McGonigal did not. After retirement, he spoke about liberty whenever asked. He testified before Congress in 1982. He described the reconnaissance flights before the attack. He described the sustained assault. He described the torpedo boats shooting at lifeboats. He stated his conviction that the attack was deliberate. No action was taken following his testimony. He testified again in 1991. He repeated his account. He requested reopening the investigation. He requested access to classified documents. His requests were denied. He died in 1999. He was 70 years old. His obituary in the Washington Post mentioned his Medal of Honor. It mentioned that he commanded a ship that was attacked during the Six-Day War. It did not mention that his own government recalled the fighters sent to help him. Admiral Isaac Kidd continued his naval career after the Liberty investigation. He was promoted to vice admiral in 1969. He held several commands. He retired in 1972 with full honors. He never discussed the Liberty investigation publicly. His personal papers were donated to the Naval War College after his death in 1999. The papers included a copy of his original investigation report with handwritten notes. The notes indicated doubts about the mistaken identity conclusion. The notes were not declassified until 2007. In 2003, the National Security Agency declassified transcripts of intercepted Israeli communications during the Liberty attack. The transcripts showed Israeli pilots reporting to their command that they could identify the American flag. The transcripts showed command acknowledging this and ordering the attack to continue. The transcripts showed Israeli torpedo boat commanders reporting American markings and being ordered to leave no survivors. The transcripts also showed United States Sixth Fleet receiving real-time distress calls from Liberty. The transcripts showed fighters being launched. The transcripts showed Admiral Geiss protesting the recall order. The transcripts showed the recall order being confirmed by Secretary McNamara on direct instruction from President Johnson. The documents were released on a Friday afternoon with minimal press coverage. Several news organizations reported the story briefly. Most coverage focused on historical interest rather than current implications. The story disappeared from news cycles within days. Lewis read the declassified documents in 2003. He was 64 years old. He had been retired for 17 years. He read the transcript showing his fighters being recalled while Liberty was under attack. He read the presidential order. He read Admiral Geiss protesting. A reporter contacted him. Lewis agreed to an interview. He described receiving the recall order. He described being 18 minutes from Liberty. He described flying back to his carrier while Americans died. He was asked if he thought the order was justified. He said no. He was asked if he understood why it was given. He said to preserve relations with Israel. He was asked if that was adequate justification. He said no. His interview appeared in a small newspaper. No major outlets picked it up. Turney spoke in 2003. He was 68 years old. He had waited 36 years. He described the torpedo boats shooting at lifeboats. He described being told the attack was a mistake. He described staying silent for decades because he was ordered to. He was asked why he stayed silent so long. He said because he was a sailor and he followed orders. He was asked if he regretted that choice. He said every day. His testimony was recorded but generated minimal attention. Ennis spoke in 2005. He was 61 years old. He described being below decks during the attack. He described the body bags and the confiscated cameras. He described being 21 years old and believing silence served a purpose. He was asked what purpose. He said none. He was asked what he wanted. He said recognition, not for himself, for the men who died. A small memorial was built in Florida in 2012. The memorial lists the names of the 34 men killed on Liberty. The memorial includes a piece of the ship's hull. Liberty survivors gather there each June 8th. The gatherings are smaller each year. Lewis died in 2010. He was 71 years old. His obituary mentioned his distinguished naval career and his Vietnam service. It did not mention Liberty. Turney died in 2018. He was 83 years old. He had spent 40 years trying to force the government to acknowledge what happened. He testified before Congress multiple times. He spoke to any reporter who would listen. He attended every memorial gathering. Nothing changed. Ennis died in 2022. He was 78 years old. He had finally spoken about Liberty in 2005, 38 years after the attack. He spent 17 years trying to tell the story. He wrote letters. He contacted representatives. He attended memorials. The official position never changed. As of 2025, fewer than 20 Liberty survivors remain alive. The youngest is in his late 70s. They continue to request a full congressional investigation. They continue to request access to all classified documents. They continue to request official acknowledgement that the attack was deliberate and that their own government abandoned them. Their requests have not been granted. The official United States government position remains that the attack on Liberty was a tragic case of mistaken identity. The Israeli government position remains the same. Both governments have declared the matter closed. The Medal of Honor, awarded to Commander McGonigal, remains the only Medal of Honor ever presented in secret. The photographs confiscated from the crew in June 1967 remain classified. President Johnson never publicly addressed the recall order. Secretary McNamara never publicly addressed it. Admiral McCain never publicly addressed it. All three men died without explaining why American fighters were ordered to abandon an American ship under attack. The survivors who spoke were not punished. The orders to remain silent were never officially rescinded, but were no longer enforced after the 2003 declassification. Speaking had no consequences. It also had no effect. The last gathering at the Florida Memorial was in June 2024. 14 survivors attended. They are in their late 70s and 80s now. They stood in front of the memorial and read the names of the 34 men who died. They described what happened on June 8, 1967. They asked the same questions they have asked for 57 years. No one answered.